Good evening and welcome to our Wednesday evening Bible class. These weeks have moved rather swiftly by, and here we are ready for lesson number 8. We're going to be talking tonight about Joseph at Potiphar's house. Alfred Lord Tennyson says in his poem Ulysses, or has his title character Ulysses say in the poem by the same name, "I am a part of all that I have met." I suspect in some ways Joseph could have said much the same thing. He had met a lot in his brief lifetime. We first met him when he was 17 years old, and we met him later when he was 30 years old. From his youth up, he had endured jealousy, rejection, hatred, physical abuse, and slavery. His brothers did capitulate enough to decide they wouldn't kill him, though that was their original plan. They chose instead to sell him into slavery. He was becoming a part of all that he had met, good and bad. Although Reuben had urged his kinsmen not to kill Joseph, Judah proposed to sell him for 20 shekels of silver to some traveling Ishmaelites. 20 shekels of silver was the price for a slave, according to Leviticus 27, verse 5. That's a tremendous downfall for a young man who had enjoyed such exaltation by his father, had had the very best of everything, was elevated far above all of his kinsmen, and now he is in an unknown country, traveling among unknown people, and suddenly enduring a life he had never imagined, sold at a slavery market. That's quite a fall. That's quite a step down. So we're going to look at the continuation of the Joseph story as we go to Genesis chapter 39, and we're going to look at the first 23 verses. And we begin by finding Joseph in a new position. He comes as a slave, but now he is promoted to the position of overseer in the house of Potiphar. We're going to look at the first 6 verses of our text. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had, except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. An old saying declares, "The mills of the gods grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine." Our God moves much more deliberately and much more purposefully. Simply reading this passage reveals the role of God expressed with this phrase, "the Lord, the Lord, the Lord." The phrase is repeated 8 times in our text. The name Joseph is repeated 12 times, since he is the central figure. But the overruling one is always going to be the Lord. In some of Joseph's situations, we might have been inclined to say, as fate would have it. But we're not dealing with fate. It's not fate that would have it. In this situation, we know exactly who was acting. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt by the Ishmaelites. You remember they are the descendants of Ishmael, the son of Abraham by Hagar, the Egyptian woman. Chickens do come home to roost. The Ishmaelites now are on their way to Egypt. And Potiphar, described for us with 3 phrases in that text, we're told that Potiphar who was an officer of Pharaoh, who was captain of the guard, and who was an Egyptian. We kind of get all of his credentials gathered right there quickly. He is official. He's captain of the guard, which must be a high official position, and he is an Egyptian. You can almost imagine Potiphar walking through the slave market, looking around for one person that he could use, and he spots Joseph. And he chooses him, and he buys him. The brothers had sold him for 20 shekels of silver. We're not told what Potiphar paid for him. The description of him a little later as being a very handsome man might have upped the price considerably. But whatever it was, Potiphar was willing to pay for it. Verse 6 tells us he was handsome in form and appearance. Good physique, good physical appearance. In that respect, he is very much like his mother Rachel. For Rachel is described in Genesis 29 as beautiful of form and appearance. He inherited something from her. And now his appearance makes a strong appeal to Potiphar. Joseph fell from the position of being favored in the house to being regarded as little more than chattel, something we can buy and sell on a market. Verse 2 begins that litany of the phrase, the Lord. The Lord who was with Joseph wherever he went, who made him successful. He's not going to rot in prison. Who prospered whatever he did. The direction Joseph chose, the actions he engaged in, God saw them to be successful. Even to the point of blessing Potiphar's house and his field, just as he will later bless the fields of Pharaoh and all Egypt. You wonder how long it took Potiphar to realize that he was benefiting greatly, and he didn't know why. He probably would not have immediately attributed it to his latest bought servant. But God saw Joseph. He oversaw Joseph. He provided for Joseph, and because it was Joseph, he provided for Potiphar, for all his household, for all his fields. And this man advanced and advanced and advanced. Interestingly enough, Potiphar became so impressed with Joseph, he turned over to him everything that he had in his own power. We'll learn a little bit later the only thing he kept from Joseph was his wife, which was right and proper. The Bible even goes so far to say that Potiphar didn't know what he had, except for the food he ate. He didn't worry about whether this provision was done, whether these people were cared for, whether these crops were harvested properly. He didn't really think about anything except making sure that his food was on the table when he wanted it. Joseph is, in every sense of the word, an overseer. He is overseeing all the work, all of the activity, and all the responsibility of Potiphar's house. Well, how long do you stay on this high level? We sometimes talk about having mountain experiences and valley experiences. Joseph is in the midst of a kind of mountain experience, but the bottom's going to drop out. And so it does as we turn to verse 7. And we look at a section of our text that talks about Joseph suffering temptation. Beginning in verse 7. And it came to pass after these things, that is, after the days of prosperity and success and everything going well, that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her, to lie with her, or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men in the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left her garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside." Because slaves were deemed property, unscrupulous owners and overseers felt totally free to use them however they wanted to. That must have been Potiphar's wife's thought. After all, this occurs right after we've read that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. She looked longingly at him. She liked his physique. She liked his handsomeness. She cast longing eyes on him. After all, he was her husband's property. He could not refuse her commands. She was the wife. Jesus will teach us later in the book of Matthew that lust of the eyes is equivalent to adultery. This woman made wrong choices, wrong requests, for all the wrong reasons. The command or the invitation, they were pretty much the same, "Come lie with me," is repeated over and over. To Joseph, it was a call to violate the law of God. He knew exactly what God expected of his people, and he would not violate that law. His first response was refusal. "I will not." I suspect Mrs. Potiphar had not heard that kind of refusal from any of the other servants. They probably had been afraid to refuse her wishes, her demands. But Joseph is firm. If God is faithful to Joseph, Joseph is faithful to God. And he will not violate God's law, he said. Our culture has adopted the phrase, "Oh, just say no." That was not an option in the house of an Egyptian slave. He couldn't just say no. That was probably a new thing in Egypt. But Joseph took a chance in being that absolute with his master's wife. He refused her. Then he tried, if refusal didn't work, he tried reason. He tried to explain to her why these actions would be inappropriate. After all, he said, "My master has put everything in my charge but you. I'm over everything in this house, but I don't have any charge over you. I don't get to make choices about you. I don't respond to you. I respond to my master." That didn't appeal to her at all. Secondly, he said to her, "But you are his wife." Even in a pagan culture, Joseph still respected God's plan for marriage. Husbands and wives are to be true to each other. She should never have thought about Joseph. She should have thought about Potiphar. Joseph respected God's plan for marriage. And then thirdly, he said, "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" For Joseph, it wasn't just a matter of appealing to the flesh. It was a great wickedness because he was violating God's law. A great wickedness. And it was to be sin against God. All sin is against God. Ultimately, he's the one whose law we violate. This sin, Joseph reasoned, was going to affect him personally. It would affect his relationship with God. It was going to affect Potiphar because his wife is about to be unfaithful to him if Joseph is willing. It's going to affect his wife, who's going to find herself in an adulterous relationship, again, if Joseph is willing. And finally, and most importantly, Joseph says it is a sin against God. We might not think about that when we're tempted with what we think of as a small sin, but we're violating God's law. Some have said that the word sin means missing the mark. God has set a mark for us to meet. He set a standard for us to live by. And when I sin, I miss that mark. And I say to God, your word really doesn't matter. But it does. It was indeed wickedness, as Joseph described it. The events in chapter 39 that we're dealing with right now immediately follow an unusual chapter in this account of Joseph. Chapter 38 tells us the horrible story about Judah raping Tamar. How does this suddenly come in the midst of the Joseph story? Is God setting us up for Joseph's temptation? Is God saying to us, look, this is the way pagans act. This is the way people act when they violate my law. And while that chapter may appear not to relate to the Joseph story, it does, because it prepares us exactly for what Potiphar's wife offers, suggests, even commands. The woman continued to pursue Joseph. The text says she did so day by day. She didn't wear out. She didn't get tired. She didn't give up. She still looked longingly on Joseph. And every day he was forced to go through the same explanation. I can't do this. It's wrong. It's wrong for you. It's wrong because it's against God. It is wickedness. How many times can you expect the man to say no? Will he wear out? Finally, a day came when all of the men were out of the house and Joseph was in there going about his work. The text doesn't tell us, but you have to wonder if she ordered all of the men out of the house. She had tried everything else. Let's see if we can set it up where there's no one here but the two of us. All of the men are out of the house. She is aggressive enough even to take hold of Joseph's garment and say to him again, come lie with me. He literally ran out of his clothes, left the house, leaving her holding his garment. This is the second experience of Joseph in losing a garment. Earlier, it was because his brothers kidnapped him and threw him into an open pit. Now it's because he is fleeing temptation and sin. She took advantage of the garment she held in her hand and used it as evidence to accuse him of attempting to assault her. After all, she had the evidence. And when Potiphar comes home, she shows it to him, and I'm sure gives a glowing account of how Joseph had tried to assault her. Look, he left his garment in my hands. I screamed, and he ran out of the house, she said. She even mocked her husband to the other servants by saying to them, look, he has brought into our house a Hebrew. And you can imagine the tone of voice she used when she named that word. This is only the second time the word Hebrew has appeared in the Bible. She uses it in a scornful manner, as if there's something dirty about him. She's brought in a Hebrew. She obviously used it in scorn and dramatized her own account of the so-called attack. This woman has none of the grace and none of the virtue of Joseph. They are literally poles apart in character. Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 27, a harlot is a deep pit, and a seductress is a narrow well. Well, Joseph has already had something to do with a pit. And a well is a confinement, and she will confine him if he gives in. By Solomon's definition, she's a harlot. She's willing to spend and be spent with anybody. He was not prepared for this pit, for this woman. One Puritan preacher said concerning this event, Joseph lost his coat, but he kept his character. Another coat gone, but Joseph's character is still sound. It has not been besmirched in any way at all. Temptation? Well, it's not a sin to be tempted. It's a sin to give in to temptation. And Paul will remind us many years later that God will, with every temptation, provide a way of escape. Joseph's way of escape was his faithfulness to God. His relationship with God took superiority over any other relationship, and he could always appeal to that. Well, this has been a domestic crisis. And you can imagine Potiphar's reaction when he comes home and his wife spells out this story. And here is his servant in whom he had placed great faith, great confidence, felt totally assured of his dependability. And now she tells this dastardly story about him. Well, Potiphar has no choice but to bring charges. We resume our reading in verse 16. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. As it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, 'Your servant did to me after this manner,' that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." When Potiphar returned home, she, standing there with Joseph's coat in her hand, boldly accused Joseph of a disgraceful act. And once again, she calls Joseph a Hebrew, as if that described a filthy and unfit individual. Potiphar's anger was so intense, he had no alternative but to put Joseph in prison. Joseph has come from a slave market now to a prison. It is interesting that Potiphar chose a rather select prison. He put him in a prison where only the Pharaoh's enemies were put, political and otherwise. Anyone who seemed to displease Pharaoh wound up being in prison. This prison, probably not as bad as a general prison was. It is there that Joseph finally is able to connect with the Pharaoh's butler and baker. And through their actions, he's able to connect with Pharaoh himself. God moves in mysterious ways, we say. And he's used a rather circuitous route to open doors again and again for Joseph. Wherever Joseph was, there was the Lord. Whatever Joseph needed, the Lord provided. Divine providence is clearly evident as part of all of these events. The Lord showed mercy. Joseph could have been killed, but the Lord showed mercy. He gave Joseph favor in the eyes of the keeper of the prison, just as he had found favor in the eyes of Potiphar. Each time the person who is over him, his superior, suddenly decides Joseph is a remarkable man. I need to take advantage of his talents, his skills, his abilities. And so the keeper of the prison turns everything over to him. All responsibilities rest with Joseph, so much so that nobody did anything that Joseph didn't approve. Once more, the Lord was with Joseph and made all that he did to prosper. He's still in prison. He's still not free to get out and go about as he pleases. He's still under the cloud of the charges that Potiphar's wife have made against him. But he moves forward. And when both the butler and the baker have strange dreams, only Joseph is able to interpret those. 3 or 4 things that I think we ought to keep in mind as we look at this particular lesson. 1, on some levels, we would say that Joseph sounds like somebody with exceptional good luck. But it's never luck when God is acting. It is providence. You have to wonder how long it took Joseph before he realized that God was the one turning things around for him. Instead of going down, 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 he's going up, up, up in every position. Why? Because God is showing favor. It would have been possible for him to have remained the rest of his years in Potiphar's house, except for Potiphar's wife. He had a good position. But God used her actions for beneficial purposes. Joseph was able to move to another setting, and from there to another setting, and from there to a much more important setting. Again, Joseph could have remained in prison and in charge, but God had other plans. You have to think about that sometimes when we read the book of Acts and hear God saying repeatedly that he has plans for Paul. He has the ideas that he wants Paul to fulfill, and he makes sure that the right moves take place, the right opportunities open up, and that's what happens to Joseph. In light of all this, we have to wonder sometimes, why are we so slow to acknowledge the providence of God when it indeed affects our lives? It's not luck. It's not circumstances. It's not we were just fortunate. It is God who opens doors. It is God who provides. Every good and perfect gift, James says, comes from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation. God's not fickle. He doesn't think one thing one day and something else another day. There is no variation. There's not even a shadow that's cast when the light changes. God is consistent, and he is consistently so in the experience of Joseph. Well, thank you for being in our class tonight. We'll continue our study of Joseph as we look at next week's lesson. Thank you very much.